بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وبعد, to continue inshallah with المهذب من إحياء علوم الدين by حجة الإسلام Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala wa radiya an, and we have reached al-Kitab al-Thamin, so the eighth section of the book, although we skipped the Kitab Asrar al-Hajj, or the issues of Hajj, and we are going to go back to that once Hajj is closer, inshallah, bi'ithnillah, so that those who are attending Hajj can benefit. So this chapter we look at the etiquettes of the recitation of the Quran, and the Imam rahimahullah ta'ala, he starts off by giving us an introduction. So he says, Tamheedun, the introduction. He says, Alhamdulillah alladhi forgive me. Alhamdulillah alladhi yamtanna ala ibadihi bi nabiyyihi al-mursal wa kitabihi al-munazzal alladhi la ya'tihi al-batilu min bayni yadayhi wa la min khalfihi tanzilun min hakimin hamid. So he starts by saying all praises to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one who has bestowed upon his ummah the blessing, or this ummah I should say, the blessing of sending to them the final messenger and revealing to them the book, i.e. the Quran, which contains within it no falsehood, nor can it be changed or manipulated, etc. And it is tanzeel, it's revelation from Hakimun Hamid, the one who is all wise, and also the one who is worthy of gratitude, and the one who recognizes those who are grateful, or perhaps the one who shows gratitude to those who are grateful to him. He says, حتى اتسع على أهل الأفكار طريق الاعتبار واتضح به سلوك المنهج القويم. And he says, through the revelation of this book, and likewise the coming of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, the people of Afkar, Ahlul Afkar, i.e. the ulama, those who want to follow in the footsteps of the ulama, those who use their capacity to understand, they were gifted the approach, the path towards understanding, and al-manhaj al-qawim, the strong methodology of understanding, was made clear to them. Was-sirat al-mustaqim, and likewise the straight path that should be followed was also made clear to them through what? The Prophet ﷺ and the Quran. Bima fassala fihi min al-ahkam, through the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran has revealed al-ahkam, has made clear the rulings, i.e. that which we are supposed to engage in, that which we are not supposed to engage in, etc. وَفَرَّقَ بَيْنَ الْحَلَالِ وَالْحَرَامِ, and distinguish the halal from the haram. فَهُوَ الضِّيَاءُ وَالنُّورُ, and therefore it, i.e. the Quran, is the ray, and it's also the light from which the ray emits. وَبِهِ النَّجَاةُ مِنَ الْغَرُورِ, and by following it there is savior from deception, from being deceived, either by ourselves or by this worldly life, or by those who want to deceive us, such as Shaitan and his soldiers. وَفِيهِ شِفَاءٌ لِمَا فِي الصُّدُورِ, and likewise within it, i.e. the Quran, there is a cure for that which is held within the chests, the hearts. He says, هُوَ حَبْلُ اللَّهِ الْمَتِينَ, it is the firm rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. it connects us to him Azza wa Jal, and it gives us a clear pathway to him. وَنُورُهُ الْمُبِينَ, and likewise it is his clear distinguishing light. وَالْعُرْوَةُ الْوُثْقَى لَا تَنْقَضِي عَجَائِبُهُ وَلَا تَتَنَاهَى غَرَائِبُهُ, and its amazing qualities and characteristics never end. No matter how much the Quran is studied, it will continue to provide that which is amazing and insightful, and so on and so forth, and its depths will never be revealed or touched until the end of time. فَكُلُّ مَنْ آمَنَ بِهِ فَقَدْ وُفِّقْ وَمَنْ قَالَ بِهِ فَقَدْ صَدَقْ وَمَنْ تَمَسَّكَ بِهِ فَقَدْ هُدِيَ. And every person who believes in it has been granted success by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وُفِّقَ, so he is a person of tawfiq. Allah has granted him tawfiq in making him from the people of Iman, and likewise it will lead him to tawfiq in this life and in the next. وَمَنْ قَالَ بِهِ فَصَدَقْ أو فَقَدْ صَدَقْ, and whoever utters that which is in the Quran, whether you recite it whether you paraphrase it, you have spoken the truth. Why? Because the Quran is the truth. وَمَن تَمَسَّكَ بِهِ فَقَدْ هُدِيَ. And whoever holds firmly to it, i.e. applies it in his life, he has been granted guidance by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَنْ عَمِلَ بِهِ فَقَدْ فَازَ. And the one who follows it in action, then he is a person of success. قال تعالى إنا نحن نزلنا الذكر وإنا له لحافظون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he informs us that he is the one who has revealed al-dhikr, the Quran, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taken upon himself responsibility for preserving it. And then he says, وَمِنْ أَسْبَابِ حِفْظِهِ فِي الْقُلُوبِ وَالْمَصَاحِفِ اسْتِدَامَةُ تِلَاوَتِهِ. From the means of preservation of the Quran, both in the hearts and in the masahif, is what? استدامة القراءة, tilawa. So to be continuous in reciting it from the masahif, to be continuous in reciting it from the hearts. And this is something which we're going to see shortly, the virtue and the benefits of this. He says, وَالْمُوَاظَبَةُ عَلَى دِرَاسَتِهِ. And likewise, to be continuous and to be disciplined in studying it, i.e. the Quran. مَعَ الْقِيَامِ بِآدَابِهِ وَشُرُوطِهِ. Whilst reading it and studying it, upholding the etiquettes and the mannerisms which one should uphold whilst interacting with the Quran. He says, وَالْمُحَافَظَةُ عَلَى مَا فِيهِ مِنَ الْأَعْمَالِ الْبَاطِنَةِ وَالْآدَابِ الظَّاهِرَةِ. Whilst preserving and conserving that which is contained within the Quran of a'mal batinah, so actions that are within ourselves, and al-adab al-zahira, and likewise the actions which are external, etiquettes which are external. He says, وَتَفْصِيلُ ذَلِكَ فِي أَرْبَعَةِ أَبْوَابٍ. And we are going to clarify and discuss the above in 4 sections. الباب الأول في فضل القرآن وأهله. The first, the virtue of the Quran and its people. الباب الثاني في آداب التلاوة في الظاهر. The second chapter or section, the etiquettes of reciting the Quran externally. The third, الباب الثالث في الأعمال الباطنة عند تلاوتي أو عند التلاوة. The inner actions that one must try to uphold whilst reciting the Quran. الباب الرابع في فهم القرآن وتفسيره بالرأي وغيره. The chapter which will look at the understanding of the Quran, interpreting the Quran, whether through opinion or other than that, i.e. the other ways of interpreting the Quran. So we move on to the first chapter. He says, الباب الأول فضل القرآن وذم المقصرين في تلاوته. The virtue of the Quran and a rebuttal of those who are negligent when it comes to reciting it. So before we start, what would your opinion be of negligence in recitation of the Quran? How little should a person be reciting in order to be considered negligent when it comes to the recitation of the Quran? What do you think? To frame it in a different way, how often should a person be reciting the Quran to be someone who has a minimal relationship with the Quran, which takes him out of being negligent of the Quran? Every day. Anyone else? Anyone else say less than every day?
Weekly.
Weekly? Anyone else?
Once in a month.
Once in a month? Anyone else? Once in a year? Anyone? We went from once a day to once a week to once a month. The last thing left is once a year. Huh? Yeah, so the correct answer is that a person should be reciting the Quran every day. Should. How much should they be reciting? 1 juz, 2 juz, 10 juz? 1 juz? Huh?
At least one juz.
At least 1 juz?
Ideals or like?
Huh?
Generally ideals, like
No. Not ideals.
generally.
Generally, standards.
Like a page.
A page?
Those.
Huh? Half the Quran. Huh? He say nus. Huh?
Minimum at least 1 page.
Minimum at least 1 page. And you said 1 juz. Huh? How much did you say? Half the Quran? So What does Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala say in At-Tibyan fi Adabi Hamalat al-Quran? It's been mentioned before. Anyone remember? He says,
Fishing it once a month, no?
No. He says that a person should be reciting the Quran daily without shadow of a doubt. But a person should recite that which is easy for him to continually recite daily. So for one person, it might be a juz. For others, it might be half the Quran, mashallah. For others, it might be a page. For others, it might be half a page. So however much you can recite daily and continue to do so, that should be your, what is referred to as wird, your daily routine with the Quran. And ideally, you want to get to a place where, ideally, as a minimum, ideally, you are reciting one chapter a day. Ideally. But remember, an ideal is where you want to get to, but a standard is where you should never fall below. The standard is that you read an amount of Quran that is easy for you to continue with daily. So for example, a person may say a page. Someone might say a page is too easy. Easy for you, but not for others. For some people, a page might take half an hour. That might be too difficult. It might be half a page. But a person wants to get to a place where they are reciting a page, half a page, 2 pages, 5 pages daily. And they want to continue until they get to that place where they are reciting one juz a day, and they continue with that as a minimum until they meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? So that they're finishing the Quran once a month at least as a minimum. And in order to get to that place, then a person should be reciting with proficiency, so that it takes about 30 minutes to 40 minutes to finish a juz. If you can read at that pace, then you're reciting with a level of proficiency. But if it's going to take you a long time because you have difficulty in reciting the Quran, you're still learning, then you don't do a juz, you do less than that. And so the routine should be daily, but the amount is dependent upon the person's ability. And a person might say, I don't know how to recite the Quran. So you know where to start then, learn. That's where you should be starting, learning. There is no excuse for a Muslim to not learn how to read the Quran. No excuse in our day and age, especially with modern tools of learning. We have had here, mashallah, those who enter into Islam and they learn how to recite the Quran within a month or two, without exaggeration. And so for those that have been Muslim for a long time of their entire life and they still cannot recite the Quran, the only thing that we can say is shame on you. And it might sound harsh, but that's the reality. And sometimes that pain is needed in order to push yourself into action. So he says, Fadilatul Quran, he speaks now about the virtue of the Quran. He says, قال عليه الصلاة والسلام خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, the best of you are those who learn the Quran and then teach it, i.e. speaking to the Sahaba and those who follow the Sahaba. He says, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام أهل القرآن أهل الله وخاصته, that the people of the Quran are the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and those who are close to Him. But the question here that we have to ask, when the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام says خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه وأهل القرآن أهل الله وخاصته, does he mean عليه الصلاة والسلام those who simply learn how to recite the Quran and teach others how to recite the Quran? Or is it inclusive of those who learn and apply? Learn and apply. Because we're going to see inshallah what he says, which kind of clarifies this point. He says, قال أبو أمامة الباهلي رضي الله تعالى عنه اقرأوا القرآن ولا تغرنكم هذه المصاحف المعلقة فإن الله لا يعذب قلبا هو وعاء للقرآن. Abu Umama رضي الله تعالى عنه, he said, recite the Quran and do not be fooled by these masahif, these collected masahif, i.e. the compiled forms of the Quran. What does he mean by that? He says, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not punish a heart that has become a utensil that carries within it the Quran. And so a person wants to learn as much of the Quran and recite as much of the Quran from his heart. Then he says, وقال ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه اقرأوا القرآن فإنكم تؤجرون عليه بكل حرف منه 10 حسنات أما إني لا أقول الحرف ألف لام ميم ولكن الألف حرف واللام حرف والميم حرف. So Ibn Mas'ud, he said, read the Quran, for indeed you are going to be rewarded for every letter that you read, 10 hasanat. Alif, lam, mim is not a harf, but alif is a harf, lam is a harf, and mim is a harf, as we mentioned previously. Then he, and the Prophet ﷺ, of course, we know this is a hadith, so Ibn Mas'ud is narrating this from the Prophet ﷺ. And if you have a statement like this where a Sahabi says that something is worth this amount of reward, generally speaking, it's come from the Prophet ﷺ. Why? Because the Sahaba cannot tell us the amount that a reward is going to be given unless it's come from revelation. Then he says, وَقَالَ الْفُضَيْلُ بْنْ عِيَاض حَامِلُ الْقُرْآنِ حَامِلُ رَايَةِ الْإِسْلَامِ. That the person who has memorized the Quran, he is a person who is a flag bearer of Islam. فَلَا يَنْبَغِي أَنْ يَلْهُ مَعَ مَنْ يَلْهُ. And so he should not be falling into play and things that are not of importance with those who fall into such things. وَلَا يَسْهُ مَعَ مَنْ يَسْهُ. Nor should he stay up late with those who stay up late. وَلَا يَلْغُ مَعَ مَنْ يَلْغُ تَعْظِيمًا لِحَقِّ الْقُرْآنِ. Nor should he be distracted by those who are distracted. Why? As a form of venerating the Quran. I.e., he should have some respect and dignity. Why? Because he has now become a holder of the Quran. وقال الحسن, and this is generally for a student of knowledge. A student of knowledge should not, it's not befitting for a student of knowledge to act in certain ways, or to dress in certain ways, or to be seen in certain places. Why? Because he is a flag bearer of Islam, and so he has to respect himself in order for Islam to be respected by others. وقال الحسن والله ما دون القرآن من غنى ولا بعده من فاقة. Al-Hasan, he said, by Allah, there is nothing after the Quran that gives you wealth, and there is nothing that you can have, there is no poverty like the poverty of the one who does not have the Quran. So there is no wealth like the wealth of the Quran, and there is no poverty like the poverty of not having the Quran. So the one who runs after this dunya and acquires this dunya and chases this dunya, even if they acquire it, they're still poor and impoverished in comparison to the person who acquires the Quran. And this shows us the state of our hearts today, because for us, the hafiz of the Quran is not really seen as much anymore. But the person who owns a house and a car and wealthy and so on is looked up to, even within the Muslim community. And it's not that the Quran alone gives a person this status. No, it's the memorization of the Quran and the application of that which is contained within it. Then he says, ذَمُّ تِلَاوَةِ الْغَافِلِينَ. So now, a rebuttal of those who recite it but they're in a state of ghafla. What does ghafla mean? Who's al-ghafil? Who is al-ghafil? Anyone know? Ghafla. Huh? Yeah, the person who's heedless, absent-minded, unaware of the reality of things. So when the ulama talk about al-ghafla, what type of ghafla do they mean? Heedlessness of the akhirah, heedlessness of the reality of this life, heedlessness of the purpose of life, heedlessness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so you can have an intelligent, sharp-minded, high-achieving person in this life, but they're far away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're ghafil. They are heedless. And you can have someone who's poor, impoverished, not very smart, intellectually speaking, hasn't really achieved much, but they know what their purpose in this life is. They are not heedless. They're not heedless. They're the opposite. He says, قال أنس بن مالك رضي الله تعالى عنه رب تال للقرآن والقرآن يلعنه. Perhaps you will find a reciter of the Quran and the Quran is cursing him. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. How so? We'll see inshallah. And then he says, وقال ابن مسعود ينبغي لحامل القرآن أن يعرف بليله إذا الناس ينامون. He says that the reciter of the Quran should be known in the night time whilst the people are sleeping. What does he mean by that? Means the person who has memorized the Quran should be known to be awake, praying and reciting whilst others are sleeping. وبنهاره إذا الناس مفطرون. And he should be known in the daytime, i.e. he should stand out in the daytime whilst the people are eating. Why? Because he's abstaining from eating too much, or he's fasting. وَبِحُزْنِهِ إِذَا النَّاسُ يَفْرَحُونَ, and he should be known by his sadness and grief when the people are in excitement and happiness. What does he mean by that? Tahammul al-Quran should be a person of huzn.
Can you say like the people that are too entertained of like worldly affairs?
Yeah, and the person who has memorized the Quran and understands it knows that the reality of things, knows the severity, knows what he's going towards and what he's leaving behind. And so he's in a state of huzn, state of fear, a state of grief. He says, وَبِبُكَائِهِ إِذَا النَّاسُ يَضْحَكُونَ, and he should be known by his crying when the people are laughing. وَبِصَمْتِهِ إِذَا النَّاسُ يَخُوضُونَ, and he should be known through his silence when the people are speaking elaborately and speaking about insignificant things. وَبِخُشُوعِهِ إِذَا النَّاسُ يَخْتَالُونَ, and he should be known by his concentrate, his khushu', his connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِذَا النَّاسُ يَخْتَالُونَ, and I believe يَخْتَالُونَ perhaps means being absent or being entertained or something of that sort. I will check inshallah. He says, وَقَالَ بَعْضُ الْعُلَمَاء إِنَّ الْعَبْدَ لَيَتْلُوَ الْقُرْآنَ فَيَلْعَنْ نَفْسَهُ وَهُوَ لَا يَعْلَمُ. Some of the ulama, they said a slave, i.e. a slave of Allah, will recite the Quran and the Quran is cursing him, or فَيَلْعَنْ نَفْسَهُ, not the Quran. So he's reciting the Quran, he's cursing himself and he doesn't realize it. How so? يقول, i.e. in the Quran, and the reciter recites, أَلَا لَعْنَةُ اللَّهِ عَلَى الظَّالِمِينَ, may the curse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is it not that the curse of Allah is upon al-zalimeen, وَهُوَ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ, and he is an oppressor against himself. So he's reciting and maybe with a beautiful sound as well, that the curse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is upon the oppressors, yet he himself is oppressing himself. And likewise when he reads about the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the kadibeen, وَهُوَ مِنْهُمْ, and he's from them. He says, وَقَالَ الْحَسَنُ, and listen to this carefully. He says, إِنَّكُمْ اتَّخَذْتُمْ قِرَاءَةَ الْقُرْآنِ مَرَاحِلِ وَجَعَلْتُمُ اللَّيْلَ جُمُلًا فأنتم تركبونه فتقطعون به مراحله وإن من كان قبلكم رأوه رسائل من ربهم فكانوا يتدبرونها بالليل وينفذونها بالنهار. He says that you have taken the Quran as marahil. You've divided the Quran up as if it's a part of a path. You want to get from this part to this part, from this part to this part, from this part to this part. وَجَعَلْتُمُ اللَّيْلَ جُمُلًا, and you have made the night your camels. فأنتم تركبونه فتقطعون أو جملا, and you've made the night your camel, sorry. فأنتم تركبونه, and so you get on the back of your camel, فتقطعون به مراحله, and you then ride through the night on your and you reach the various stages of your path, i.e. I'm going to finish this amount of ajza from this time to this time, then this amount from this time to this time, and so on and so forth. He says, as for those who came before you, رَأَوْهُ رَسَائِلَ مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ, they saw the Quran as letters from their Lord to them. فَكَانُوا يَتَدَبَّرُونَهَا بِاللَّيْلِ, and so at night they were reflecting over that which was sent to them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَيُنَفِّذُونَهَا بِالنَّهَارِ, and they would apply it during the day. And so he's saying, look, the reality, the difference, that for you, the Quran is something to be recited. Just recite it. And we're happy. Last night I recited 5 ajza. Whereas the Sahaba, their approach was what? Their approach was to try to understand it, to reflect upon it, and then to apply it in their life. وقال ابن مسعود أنزل القرآن عليهم ليعملوا به فاتخذوا دراسته عملا. Ibn Mas'ud, he said, the Quran was revealed to them, i.e. to the people, so that they can apply it and act upon it. But instead of applying and acting upon the Quran, they took the study of it as action. Simply studying the Quran became their amal. As for the actual application, they left it off. He says, إِنَّ أَحَدَكُمْ لَيَقْرَأُ الْقُرْآنَ مِنْ فَاتِحَتِهِ إِلَى خَاتِمَتِهِ مَا يُسْقِطُ مِنْهُ حَرْفًا وَقَدْ أَسْقَطَ الْعَمَلَ بِهِ. He says, one of you will recite the Quran from the Fatiha all the way to the khatima. You will start from the beginning until the end. And you do not drop one single harf, i.e. you give it its haqq in the tajweed and in the tilawah. You give its tilawa the correct haqq. You give the makharij the correct haqq. You do not drop a single letter, but yet you have dropped the action of it in its entirety. You focus on the recitation with absolutely no focus on the application. And so when we go back now, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, خَيْرُكُمْ مَنْ تَعَلَّمَ الْقُرْآنَ وَعَلَّمَهُ. The best of you are those who learn the Qur'an and teach it. Is it simply learning how to recite the Qur'an and then teaching how to recite the Qur'an? No. It's learning how to recite the Qur'an for the sake of application, not simply for the sake of recitation alone, which has become our way today, unfortunately. And then we come to al-bab al-thani fi zahiri adab al-tilawa, so the external etiquettes of recitation, and we'll start with this next week inshallah, as it's a new section bi-idhnillah. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad.